Oh, thank you.
I could hear
Okay, recording. Okay, before we get started, just a couple of announcements. For those who are local, we are going to bless John Paul and Lisa's house afterwards. And some of the people on, like Virginia, was bummed that I didn't give her more of a heads up because she could have been here. So in that vein, I'm going to give you a heads up on the Christmas party early. So put on your calendars and I will put it in the next email out to you. We always do our Christmas party on a Sunday, December 10th at 5 o'clock. So I'm going to put that on. Yes.
Say something about blessing a house. It's something that actually goes way back. There's a traditional blessing in Hebrew for a new house. And it was a thing that was commonplace. In fact, it was expected. And somehow we've lost that. And so I was really pleased when Lisa asked if we could do that. And those of you that get to go, that get to be there, it's something that should be a reminder to all of us. So Lisa and John Paul, thank you.
So we're going to go immediately after this and be there 10:30 to, and it won't last long, 10:30 to 11. Okay. Now, where did we leave off? We left off, we are studying Matthew. And remember, Matthew is divided into 5 sections. We just finished section 3 and we almost finished section 3. We're on chapter 13. And remember, these chapters we had done up to 13 were looking at people's reaction to Jesus. Some believed in him, some questioned whether he was the Messiah, and some out and out did not believe he was the Messiah. I'm going to take us to chapter 13, verse 53, which is the last section of chapter 13.
Are we going to show a baby picture first?
Oh, yes. Okay. Baby pictures first. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Yes, we were out of town all week, and I think we ought to at least show one. We've gotten a whole bunch of requests, but this thing is just, they updated Zoom and it's behaving, but this is the reason we were out of town. And she's 9 months old and walks like crazy. So anyway, and that's enough of that for now. So if I can get the mouse to work, but come on. Yes, dear. I know where stop share is. The mouse cursor isn't showing up. And I did. Her birthday is in 3 months, but we went ahead and took an early birthday present. We bought her a drum, and she wakes up at 5 o'clock in the morning and plays her drum. Mission accomplished. So anyway, let's do. You get a chance to get a little bit of revenge. Later on in life.
And for those of you guys who are local, I did change out the moving screen to local pictures.
All right, let's get back to it.
Okay, so we are on chapter 13, verse 53. When Jesus had finished these parables, he withdrew from that place. Coming to his hometown, he taught the people in their synagogue, and they were astonished. Where did this man get such wisdom and miraculous powers, they asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother named Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us as well? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, only in his hometown and in his own household is a prophet without honor. And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief.
And some of it speaks for itself. I mean, I think that's probably the idea of not being maybe revered in your own hometown because they know you too well. The one statement, and I'm only going to say a little tiny bit about it, it is one of those things that inflames a lot of passions. They talk about the people said he spoke. We're always told that he spoke so well, so knowledgeably, so powerfully, and yet these people in his own hometown said, oh, basically, who does he think he is? We've known him since he was a kid. He was terrible at stickball, and they just aren't willing to accept that he can be certainly not Messiah, but that he can even be a rabbi. What makes him think he's worthy of this? And then they say something that is amazing, how much tension and arguments this causes. He says, aren't his brothers here among us and his sisters? And there are some denominations who say that Jesus absolutely had no siblings. And we made the mistake of having the discussion one time, and we won't make that mistake again. I'll refer you to what that says, and you can decide what it means. It doesn't offend or bother me either way. If someone says just absolutely no, I'm not going to get upset about it, because it's really not very important to the teachings. But you can see what it says and make up your own mind.
And he was in Nazareth, and that was the end of that. We are now going to start the next section in Matthew, and it starts in, yeah.
Before we leave that there, those people are having real concerns about the Messiah, or Jesus, the man, the boy growing up. Is this making any reference to it, or is it just an ordinary neighborhood conversation? Hey, man, I know that guy.
Are they objecting to him because of the rumors that this is the Messiah? And we really don't know anymore. We could speculate. Probably that's part of it. But even being a respected rabbi that has the kind of following that he has, who is he? He's no better than the rest of us. Do you remember there's a point where they're questioning and they say he's from Nazareth? And he actually, he's not. He's actually from Bethlehem, but he's from Nazareth because that's where he grew up. And they said, did anything good ever come from Nazareth? I'm not going to name a town because it would be a joke for me and it would offend some. But it's one of those things where they're expecting the Messiah clearly to be someone of noble birth and to have that background and bearing. But even so, your answer is, I don't know. But even for a high profile Messiah, Nazareth is just, but to the people who live there, they probably have been subject to this. Nothing good ever came from Nazareth their whole life. And so they're saying he's no better than us. He comes from right here where we do. I don't know the rest of it. What you're asking, there's just no way of knowing.
So it's scandalous.
So what scandal? It is in fact a stumbling block. Thank you, Gene. That's one of our words for the study on Matthew, the stumbling block, the scandalon. And for them, the idea that he comes from here in Nazareth is a stumbling block. I'm just not going to believe, because he can't be who he claims to be, therefore he isn't. It's a good point.
So we're going to show a 7-minute video from Bible Project. For those of you who've seen it before, Bible Project does an incredible overview of the Gospels, and Bible Project divided Matthew up into part 1 and part 2. Can you see if you can show that?
I'm going to try. And we don't usually do this, but Matthew is divided into sort of sections, and they do such a good job.
And remember, it's this sheet, and I'll send that one out again too. Okay. Share the sound.
We've seen that one.
Yes, we have. Okay. Does anybody? It's always a treat when we come in, and on Saturday nights, Zoom likes to do their updates, and suddenly things aren't behaving. So
The Gospel according to Matthew.
Can you give
In
us
the first video, we saw how Matthew introduced Jesus as the Messiah from the line of David and as a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and also as Emmanuel, which in Hebrew means God with us. After Jesus announced and taught about the arrival of God's kingdom, and after he brought the kingdom into day-to-day life among the people of Israel, we saw that Jesus was accepted by many, but rejected by others, especially Israel's religious leaders, the Pharisees. And so the big question is, how is this conflict between Jesus and Israel's leaders going to play itself out? The next large section, chapters 14 through 20, explore all the different expectations people have about the Messiah. So Jesus keeps healing sick people, and twice he even miraculously provides food for these huge crowds in the desert. One's made up of Jewish people, and the other is a non-Jewish crowd. And this sign, it's very similar to what Moses did for Israel in the wilderness. And so all these people are excited about Jesus. They think he's the great prophet and the Messiah, but not the religious leaders. Their view of the Messiah is built on passages like Psalm 2 or Daniel chapter 2 about a victorious Messiah who's going to deliver Israel and defeat the pagan oppressors. And from their point of view, Jesus, he's a false teacher. He's making blasphemous claims about himself. And so there are stories here about them increasing their opposition, hatching a plan to kill him. And so in response, Jesus, he withdraws, and he begins teaching his closest disciples what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah, because it is not what anybody expects. So Jesus asks his disciples, chapter 16, he says, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter comes up with the right answer, it seems. He says, "Well, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." But then it becomes clear that Peter's thinking about a king who's going to reign victoriously through military power. And Jesus challenges Peter, saying that, yes, I am going to become king, but through a different way. And so Jesus starts to teach on themes from the prophet Isaiah, who said that the Messianic king would suffer and die for the sins of his own people. And so Jesus, he was positioning himself as a Messianic king who reigns by becoming a servant and who would lay down his life for Israel and the nations. Well, Peter and the disciples, they mostly just don't get it. And so Jesus enters into the fourth block of teaching, followed by a series of teachings after that. And these are all about the upside-down nature of Jesus' messianic kingdom, which turns upside down all of our value systems. So in the community of the servant king, you gain honor by serving others. And instead of getting revenge, you forgive and do good to your enemies. And in Jesus' kingdom, you gain true wealth by giving your wealth away to the poor. To follow the servant Messiah, you must become a servant yourself. In the next section, we watch the two kingdoms clash, Jesus' kingdom and that of Israel's leader. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for Passover riding in on a donkey, and the crowds are hailing him as the Messiah. And Jesus immediately marches into the courtyard of the temple, and he creates this huge disruption that brings the daily sacrifices to a halt. His actions speak louder than words here. As Israel's king, Jesus was asserting his royal authority over the temple, the place where God and Israel met together. And in Jesus' view, the temple was compromised by the hypocrisy of Israel's leaders. And so here he's challenging their authority, and naturally, they're deeply offended. And so they try to trap Jesus and shame him in public debate, and they fail. So they end up just determining to have him killed. In response, Jesus delivers his final block of teaching. He first offers this passionate critique of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, and then he weeps over Jerusalem and its rejection of God and his kingdom. Then Jesus withdraws with the disciples, and he starts telling them what's going to happen. He's going to be executed by these leaders, but in doing so, they're going to create their own demise, because instead of accepting Jesus' way of the peaceful kingdom, they're going to take the road of revolt against Rome, and so Jerusalem and its temple are going to be destroyed. But, Jesus says, that is not the end of the story. He's going to be vindicated after his death by his resurrection. And one day, he'll return and set up his kingdom over all nations. And so in the meanwhile, the disciples need to stay alert and stay committed to just announcing Jesus and his kingdom and spreading the good news. And so with all of that ringing in the disciples' ears, the story comes to its climax. That night, Jesus takes the disciples aside and he celebrates a Passover meal with them. The Passover retells the story of Israel's rescue from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And then Jesus takes the bread and the wine from this meal as new symbols, showing that his coming death would be a sacrifice that would redeem his people from slavery to sin and evil. After the meal, Jesus is arrested. He's put on trial before the Sanhedrin, a council of Jewish leaders, and they reject his claim to be the Messiah. They charge him with blasphemy against God. Then Jesus is brought before the Roman governor, Pilate, and he thinks Jesus is innocent, but he gives in to the pressure from the Jewish leaders, and he sentences Jesus to death by crucifixion. So Jesus is led away by Roman soldiers and crucified. Now, you'll notice right here in this section that just like Matthew did in the opening chapters, he increases the number of references to the Old Testament. He's trying to show that Jesus' death was not a tragedy or a failure. Rather, it was the surprising fulfillment of all of the old prophetic promises. Jesus came as the servant Messiah, spoken of by Isaiah. He was rejected by his own people, but instead of judging them, he is judged on their behalf, bearing the consequences of their sin. So the crucifixion scene, it comes to a close, and Jesus' body is placed in a tomb. But the book ends with a surprising twist, the last chapter. The disciples, they discover on Sunday morning that Jesus' tomb is empty. And then all of a sudden people start seeing Jesus alive from the dead. And the book concludes with the risen Jesus giving a final teaching called the Great Commission. Jesus says that he is now the true king of the world. And so he sends his disciples out to all nations with the good news that Jesus is Lord and that anyone can join his kingdom by being baptized and by following his teachings. And echoing all the way back to his name, Emmanuel, God with us, from chapter 1, Jesus' last words in the book to his disciples are, "I will be with you." It's a promise of Jesus' presence until the day he finally returns. And that's the gospel according to Matthew.
So what I'll send out, I'll send out the link of both the Bible Project, Matthew 1 and Matthew 2, because and both of them are about 7 minutes, 8 minutes long. And when you listen to part 1 now, I don't know, for me, it's like, oh, I know this stuff now, because it divides it up. I think it gives a good overview to do it. And then this is, I come back to it every week. So I'll send those out. So we are in 14 through 20, which is going to talk about the different expectations of the Messiah. And I'm going to start in chapter 14. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been telling him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Although Herod wanted to kill John, he was afraid of the people because they regarded John as a prophet. On Herod's birthday, however, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod, so much that he promised with an oath to give to her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was grieved, but because of his oath and his guest, he ordered that her wish be granted and sent to have John beheaded in prison. John's head was brought in on a platter and presented to the girl, who carried it to her mother. Then John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and they went and informed Jesus.
So it's kind of an odd place to start the second section. He's talking about John the Baptist, the baptizer. And there are a few things that are probably worth noting. For one, Herod is nominally a Jew, but his family, and some of you have heard this, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but they were sort of subjugated by Israel, and they were forced to convert at sword point. And so there's a lot of bitterness, and a lot of people wonder, if Herod was a Jew, how come he was so mean to his own people? Well, he's not. He's an Idumean or an Edomite, but his family has lived as Jews for a long time. So John, the baptizer, Herod being king, thinks he can do anything, and he goes and marries his brother's wife. And his brother's still alive, and they're not divorced. He just takes his brother's wife. And John says, "This, you're not permitted to do this." And he's right, of course, by Jewish law, but most people at that time, the custom would be that's off limits what he's done. And Herod, being king, says, you don't get to talk to me like that. And he has him thrown in prison. Interesting, this is the first time we hear, though, he would like to kill John, but he's afraid that the people will rise up against him. That's something you can't afford. They think he's a prophet. So as long as he keeps him in prison, it's okay. We hear that about Jesus later on very strongly, that the Pharisees and that bunch, the leaders wanted to kill him, but they're afraid of the people. They're afraid that they'll rise up against them. So this is the first time we hear it, and it's about John. And Herod's having a birthday party. And I guess he's got a whole bunch of important friends in. He's king after all. And he has girls dancing. And his stepdaughter, the woman he's now married to, they bring in the stepdaughter. And she must dance really well because he's showing off. And he says, that was pretty fantastic. Name it, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And this wife has already told the daughter, she probably gave her instructions about dancing. I don't know. But she says, if he asks you this, tell him what you want as the head of John the Baptist. She's obviously taken a step up. Now she's married to the king, and she doesn't like having this guy call him out. So Herod, it says, can't go back. He has made this promise in front of all of his birthday party friends. Can't go back on it. So he puts aside his fear of the uprising and has somebody go out and execute John, cut his head off. And the girl actually puts the head on a platter and takes it to her mother. And that whole thing is pretty twisted. But what I want you to get out of today is 14, this new section starts here. There's a reason why why Matthew tells us this. It's a good history lesson, but it's a lot more than that, okay? And I want you to catch this. I'll make it abundantly clear. But look at what happens next. They take John's body, his disciples get the body and bury it, and then they go and tell Jesus. That seems to be like the first thing. Your cousin, the prophet, the one who was to make the way straight for you to turn the people's hearts to repentance, has been killed. And I want you to look at the response.
So this next story is the feeding of the 5,000, and it is a Bible section that most of us have heard many times. But when it started, remember, we always say there was no verses and chapters, and I should have stopped halfway through 13. So it says, then John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and they went and informed Jesus. When Jesus heard about John, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. That should have really been up with the previous section.
And let's go ahead, since that would have been,
Yeah.
you're right, that would have been
just
cool.
up-
But as Mary said, we always try and make sure that you hear. There were no chapters and verses when these things were written. We've added those. And so this is a teaching Matthew is giving us, and that we always will hear about the part about John being killed, and then the sermon stops. And then we pick up with the feeding of the 5,000, and we don't understand that these two things that Matthew was teaching us are related. John's disciples come and tell Jesus that he's been killed. And it says, hearing this, Jesus withdrew to a private place. And in that, you have to see this idea that he is also human. This death of John affects him. And it's no accident that immediately on hearing, they told Jesus, and it says, Matthew tells us, and when Jesus heard this, he withdrew to a private place. The death of John affects him. And so let's keep going, because there's a lot more here than
So when you're in a church and hear this, they don't start with this next word either, but they start with the next word, but. So it says, but the crowds found out about it and followed on foot from the towns. When he stepped ashore and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. When evening came, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is already late. Dismiss the crowds so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." "They don't need to go away," Jesus replied. "You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes," they answered. "Bring them here to me," Jesus said, and he directed the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he spoke a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 5,000 men were fed, in addition to women and children.
So let's start with the part, he withdrew to a private place, or withdrew privately to a solitary place. They've gone out on the boat. And it says that the crowds hear about it, and they're following him now. They hear it and they go on land and try and get out ahead to track him down. And it says when they get to the shore and he sees the crowds, he felt compassion on them, right? And he healed all of their sick. We don't get told this, but this is one of the most amazing examples of love your neighbor as yourself. Remember, he has gone to get away, to go to a solitary place following the news of the death of John. And the people, they only know their own desperation, and they track him down. And rather than getting up and seeing them and getting angry, isn't that what most of us would do? Don't you know I'm grieving here too? I have needs too. Can't you give me 15 minutes alone? You have to do this. He sees them and he sees their desperation, and he feels compassion for them at a moment when, we'd be saying, hey, I need a little compassion too. And we get taught that he tells us to love your neighbor as yourself. But what does that look like? And honestly, in that situation, I would think that most, if not all of us, that are already feeling the weight of this death would say, leave me alone. Give me, come back tomorrow, right? Come back tomorrow and we'll see what we can do. And instead, he feels the compassion for them and for their needs. And it is an amazing picture that we get. It is one of the most beautiful examples, models of love your neighbor as yourself. And it's right there in front of us. I mean, you can't miss the connections, but we don't usually get taught about that. That's what he's saying. And so he heals all of them. And then the disciples, ever practical, say, it takes a long time to heal this many people. We've been out here a long time. And here, what are we going to do with all these people? It's going to get the natives are getting restless. So what you need to do is now send them back home and let them eat. That's a very normal response too. It's a thing that we should learn from. They're saying, we can't feed all these people and they need food. And it's this idea that, we're doing it for their benefit. Yeah, we're doing it for them. They need some food, so send them away. And we tell you fairly often, I strongly believe that through most all of this, what we call Jesus ministry, he's talking this way, but he's teaching this way to his disciples. He's preparing them for what they're going to do and who they're going to be. And they're going to be the ones to carry the gospel. So he tells them, you don't need to send them home. They don't need to go home. You give them something to eat. And Mary and I were talking about this yesterday while we drove. I don't know if any of you who have ever had a boss that tells you to do something that's just impossible. And you're standing there going, you don't understand. And I've had bosses tell me, just find a way, just get it done. I don't need to know how, just get it done. And you're just astounded. And so that's what they do. They tell him, look, all we got here is what, 5 loaves and a couple of fish. That's not really enough for us. And it's this teaching to them. They're going to learn something from this because, you know, there's a point where Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? And he says, you know, I love you. And he says, then feed my sheep. And it doesn't mean, I'm convinced it doesn't mean that every time we should be out feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but that is going to be their position, their job as shepherds of the people, if you will. And they're going to clearly see something miraculous here. They're going to have to rethink things because they're convinced our only choice is to send people away. And what he's showing them is, no, you don't have to send people away. And so this is what happened. He's bring them here. He blessed them. And this is the part we balk at. This is the part we hear in sermons. And it sort of divides, I don't know, ministers into 2 groups. They either get apologetic for, doesn't mean that he literally fed that, or because we're so scared of something this miraculous, we just get belligerent. And it really, really happened. I think it really, really happened. But the feeding of the 5,000 is a tool in this case. It's part of the teaching. The compassion that he has felt staying with them, he continues to feel. And he's got to be worn down after this death of John. And then after the day he's had, and he blesses them, he says, now go feed them. And they get to stay here. That's going to be a model for them for the rest of the time. That's their ministry after he's dies and is resurrected.
But it's the real lesson that's when Jesus, the man, transformed to Jesus, the God. Because the men I'm hearing the disciples say, hey, send them away, you know, do the right thing, go out and eat. And they don't see Jesus at the spiritual level, at the godly level.
You know, Gene, that's a tough question, is that because when they begin to, the other thing we learn is that they see things and then they still wind up with doubts, and they see more things and they still wind up with doubts. And is that not us that we wind up there?
That's the lack of understanding, and I'm not sure that we can ever understand according to Paul, but that's the example. You want to be Jesus follower, you got to pay the price, and you got to kick it up a notch.
Well, there's no doubt. Is this the first moment? I'm not sure. You know, we don't know exactly that. It certainly, though, is one of the big moments in this.
Well, and we'll see in the next story that, you know, he just enabled them to feed 5,000 people, and then there's some disbelief. And I think it's one of those things, you know, it's like one of the things I have problems with sometimes the church is this idea that once you're a believer, everything's easy and you're always going to believe. I just believe that it is a journey and a struggle all your life. And that's what the gospel tells us. These disciples who were with Jesus still had doubts even when they saw things.
We love to judge 2,000 years dead people and say, if I had seen everything you've seen, I would never doubt ever. What is wrong with them? And we miss the teaching that we're supposed to see in them. We're supposed to see us. I don't know how you get around it. People love to do that, though. And so exactly what you said, they see this incredible miracle. And as Mary said, the very next story, you're going to see that didn't seal the deal for Peter.
And oftentimes when you're in church, you're not going to hear the feeding of the 5,000. And the next story is Jesus walks on water. And those are 2 different Sundays and they're not related. That's why it's so important, I think, to study the Bible like this, because they are related and they all started in chapter 14 with the beheading of John. So they do go together.
But I also think that that's, again, from the Old Testament, Isaiah is telling you, you gotta open your eyes. And you can see, but your eyes are open, but you're not really seeing, you're not receiving the message. And he comes to fulfill it.
I unfortunately have to learn the same lesson more than once.
Okay, I agree.
And it is the message. And that's why we study. That's why we look at these things and say, because the next time it happens, we remember much quicker. We say, oh, I've been here before. I've done this. And as Mary says, it's a journey. It's a path that we walk. But let's read the stop of that into the first section in our Bible.
Okay. I'm on Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After he had sent them away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already far from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it.
So the first thing, the reason I want to stop there is you remember how this started. He hears about John. He tries to go away to a solitary place, and the people are there, and his compassion for them kicks in, and he stays to meet their needs and not his own. And so after this whole feeding and everything else was done and evening comes, he sends his disciples out in a boat and on ahead. They're going to cut across the corner of the Sea of Galilee. And this is sort of the price of being a disciple. That's what disciple means, is you live by the discipline, by the teaching of the rabbi, the master. And so if he says, you go ahead, they're thinking, no, we'll stay here and help you clean up or something. And instead they get in the boat and they just go. Grow up in Texas, you grow up with a lot of colorful phrases, right? There's one of them that says, never mind if the horse goes blind, just load the wagon. And that's sort of the deal. He says, you guys, it's evening, you go on ahead and I'll catch up with you. And they take the boat and leave. And what it says next is he goes up on the hillside by himself to pray. So you see that this idea of getting away after the death of John, solitary place to be by himself and to pray. Don't leave that part out, by the way. It didn't end. Just after he took the time because the people needed him. And that is a continuation of this lesson to us. He still needed or wanted the solitary time, but not until he had done the things that the people needed, that compassion called for, that he loved neighbors as himself. So he goes up, evening comes, he's by himself. When we live there, the Sea of Galilee is one of the most disappointing things I've ever seen. They call it Lake Kinneret. They don't even call it a sea. And what it is it's surrounded by mountains. It's like a bowl. And because of that, you can always see the other side. You lose a sense of how big this thing really is. And we looked at it and just said, you're kidding me, right? You remember the storm, but waves can get bigger the deeper the water is. Most of a wave is under the water. And when water's deep, and we see it in the winter here, the waves get smaller because the tides are low, and we don't have the big waves. So this is a really weird thing. You have this picture of the Sea of Galilee, and then the first time you see it, you go, oh man, I don't know. How can I believe that now? And what we didn't know until later was that the Sea of Galilee gets really, really treacherous. The water is deep, and it is really deep. And when the wind comes over the top of those mountains and hits, the waves build up. And by the time you get on the far side, the waves are enormous. People die. People that fished, all these people who fished had to have known someone who's died. So he sends them out, and it says that he's there by himself, and they're out in the boat, and they're already far from shore, but he can still see them because they're fighting the wind and waves. This is also the beginning of another teaching for them that carries down to us.
Verse 25, during the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus spoke at once. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "command me to come to you on the water." "Come," said Jesus. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of Peter. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they had climbed back into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
So they're out, and they haven't made a lot of progress. And I think certainly he knew that. He knew it was going to happen. And so you guys, you're going out there. I'm going to be up here alone praying for a while. And then when he gets ready, he just goes to them. And this is another one of those things that astound us and threaten us and everything else. But as he's coming out, they see him and they're scared to death. They say, "This has got to be a ghost," because clearly this never happens. This has got to be, something. This is not a person. I spent a lot of time on the water. I've floundered my whole life. I'm out on the water while all the rest of you are asleep. And I can tell you that on anything but the darkest nights, you let your eyes adjust, you can see an awful lot. I know I've heard people say, "Well, how could they see him if it was the middle of the night?" Well, you just can't. Yeah, I mean, you just can. And once your eyes adjust, and if you spent your life out there like some of them have, this is not even surprising. But they're scared, and they say this is a ghost. And I want you to look at what Jesus says. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." How often do we get a chance to say, the people see something, they see an angel, they see God's messenger, they see something, and the first words out of their mouths is "fear not"? The angel that comes to Mary says, "Fear not." Joseph sees this angel in a dream that tells him it's okay, and he tells him, "Fear not." The shepherds, as the angels announce Jesus' birth, tell him first thing, "Fear not." I know people, I've heard people say, "I would love to see an angel. I would love to see one of these big things." And I sometimes say it out loud, and sometimes I just think you probably wouldn't, because the first thing that would be required is a message to you, "Fear not." And we get that example again, over and over again. And this idea of us being able to live without fear is another one of those big themes. It's one of the big themes with me. It is part of the gift that we're given. And so what you see is he tells them, "Fear not." And Peter, we did a study on Peter one time, and Peter often speaks before thinking. And I love him for it. I mean, the guy is just bold. He just, if he thinks it, he says it. And he sees that it's Jesus. And, you don't know if it's a test or if it's just him overcome with the moment. But he says, if it's really you, just command me and I'll walk out there to you. What is it, a goofy thing to say or a really amazing thing to say? I suppose it's some of both, but that's Peter. Peter is just gung-ho. And he says, if you are willing, I'll walk out there to you. And he says, then come. Yeah, you want to do it? Just come. And he gets out, he's up for a bit, and then immediately begins to doubt. and begins to sink. And there, once again, is that image of us. You know, the man whose child is sick and comes to Jesus. And Jesus says, do you believe? And he says, yes, Lord, I believe. Help me with my unbelief. I mean, I do, but this, you know, this strains us. Help me with my unbelief. And here's Peter. And he goes to Peter and he lifts him up and he says, why did you doubt? Why would you doubt? They just got done feeding 5,000 people with five loaves, or more than five, but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And there we are thinking, man, if I had seen that, I would never doubt again. And this is the same evening. And he's already spent some time and steps on top of the water. And then it just gets too hard. And we see that later on, when he's questioned, when Jesus is on trial, and someone says, aren't you one of his disciples? And he says, yeah, no, it was too much. But Jesus had already told him, you're going to be pushed over the limit. And he knew that. So here it is. And you know, here is this, even though Peter doubts, Jesus pulls him up and they get in the boat. And as we're told, as soon as he gets in the boat, the seas calm down. And what's their response? Oh my gosh, this really is the Messiah. This really is the Son of God. We'll never doubt you again.
Yes, we will. But, you know, and he had just fed 5,000, and didn't they believe it then? I'm going to give another commercial, and before I read this last section, we've often, if you're looking for a good show, look at The Chosen. The Chosen's about to start season 4, but season 1 through 3, you can get it on almost any streaming device for free. The Angel Studios has all of the first 3 seasons of The Chosen. And the reason I say it now is because season 3, the last portion, during that season, they do the feeding of the 5,000, and they also do this scene of Jesus walking on water and Peter coming out to him. And it is just a very powerful scene. Some of the things that it brought to my attention, first of all, that, you know, there was 12 disciples on this boat. And looking at Peter once he got back on the boat, and just his emotions and the other disciples' emotions right here. I mean, we just read, you know, they got back into the boat and they worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. But the power of that scene is pretty
You couldn't
incredible.
possibly put that in a film, and yet they do. Yes, sir.
For me, it makes going back to the centurion's faith that much more amazing.
Isn't it though?
Because even Jesus said, I've never seen faith like this.
Wow, no, you're absolutely right. And if you can't hear at home what John Paul just said, is it makes going back to the centurion's faith even that much more amazing. And that Jesus says, I've never seen faith like this. That's a big statement. And it is. This guy's, you know, he's a centurion. He's a powerful man in the Roman culture.
And the centurion recognizes that he's not worthy for Jesus to come to his house.
You want to trade seats with me? Yeah, no, the centurion recognizes he's not worthy. It is. That's a great point. It really is. I mean, it does make that amazing. And here's these people who travel with him and know, but still it strains them. It's still hard.
This last section, chapter 14, verse 34. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of the place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding region. People brought all the sick to him and begged him just to let them touch the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched him were healed.
So I'll shut it down pretty quick here. It's about time. But when we watch that short video clip, there's something that he kind of mentions. It's a big deal, you know, that when he is crucified, Matthew helps us not see that as a failure, not see it as they killed him. And it's something you'll hear from me anytime I get the opportunity. there's a point in this ministry where it becomes very obvious. Jesus has been avoiding the appearance that he's building an army. And these crowds begin to come, and the crowds swell. And there comes a point where it's very obvious that he sort of thins the herd. He delivers that statement about, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And people just, I say this a lot because they say, this is hard teaching, we can't follow it. That's the scandalon, Gene, that's the stumbling block, that's too much. And the crowds begin to dwindle. And right about that same time, Jesus very obviously, very conspicuously begins to pick a fight with the Pharisees, with the leaders. I mean, he begins to direct comments at them that absolutely ensure that they're going to want to kill him. He doesn't leave it to chance. He does things in such a way that makes that an absolute certainty. And we see a point where all of a sudden you can tell he says, okay, it's time. I've done all this, I've set the stage, and now it's time to go to Jerusalem. And again, he touched on it. People also somehow love to say, well, the Jews killed Jesus, or the Romans killed, they killed. No. He laid down his life. This was a sacrifice. And so keep an eye open for that as we go into these next sections. You're going to begin to see these comments become inflammatory. It's no accident. It's not an accident. He makes sure that by the time he gets to Jerusalem, they're going to kill him. It is a planned, purposeful sacrifice. And so right now, what we see is these crowds are coming, and the word of the healing gets out, and every place they land, somebody finds out, and word has traveled around the Galilee. And when they find out he's here, they tell everybody. That's a very human thing. I told you first, I was the one who told me, but come and get healed. The people are at this point flocking in, and it could look to Rome easily like what's happening here is he's building an army. And this is the Messiah that a lot of them expect. So as we keep going with this, start looking for the ways that he makes sure that's not the perception. He's leaving no doubts about whether or not he's going to be that kind of a king. He makes sure that that doesn't develop. Is that it?
That's it.
God, when we see a lesson like this, when we see Jesus doing things that we won't do, when we see the examples of love your neighbors yourself, it's hard not to look at ourselves and think how often we love ourselves more than our neighbors, how often we fail to follow that. And we appreciate the words, the inspired words that you leave behind that point to us, that show us how it's possible to do things within the kingdom of God and do them differently. And if I could ask for one thing today, is that lesson would be with us this week, because we always encounter those people that you put in front of us that need you, not us, but they need the message that we carry. And they do need the care and the comfort that you can provide and that we're here to carry out. Be with us now as we go over to Lisa and John Paul's house, and help us to see in that also this idea of the shared life of the body that we are given as a gift, and to take part in that fully. Remember those we pray for, we don't forget. help us to have the faith to understand that you do touch people, that you do listen when we pray. Again, we just ask that you be with those and bring that peace and comfort that only you have. Amen.
Okay, a couple quick announcement. Green Bay Packers play at 3:00. And it's number 89.
He is-
89, and he had his first NFL catch the last game, so hopefully he'll have another one this game. That's Ben Sims. The address of your house, Lisa, is?
510 Scott.
510 Scott, and Terry and Rob, if you want to come, 510 Scott, we're going to bless the house at 10:30. And let me see, I had something else. Scott, Bobcat.
Please,
Lockhart. Anita's having a reception for Bob Lockhart at what time, Anita?
1 to 4.
1 to 4. Okay, thank you, guys.
Happy Sunday.
Please take a video of the blessing for those of us that can't make it.
That's interesting. If we can, we will, I guess. I hadn't planned on it, but it seems like something we'll try and do.
Okay.
Isn't it-
Okay, thank you.
Sending our blessings too.
What's that?
Terry,
We're sending
Terry-
our blessings too for the house. We'll be there in spirit.
We know that. Thank you, Julie.
Yes.
Isn't it weird though that I suddenly don't remember ever disliking the Green Bay Packers?
It's because we've
Go
been wearing
Green
green
Bay.
and gold for so many years.
Terry and Rob, may you guys have an amazing, wonderful wedding next weekend as well. Best of luck. Hopefully things don't get crazy before they get wonderful. So
Amen.
Can you?
Amen.
Can I move it? Yes, no, I don't know. There.
There you go, got it.